say let's start the panel. It's really the third day of our conference, and after so many exciting topics and presentations, this is really like the final conclusion on our big topic, and that is the crisis in 2020s as a watershed of global condition or change in global condition. And due to the circumstances, I will not follow the order which was planned, and that is me giving introduction, and then one by one panelists, starting with Ugur, and then going to Christian, Edna, and Vladimir. But instead, we will hear right away Ugur's presentation, and it is there are several reasons to do that. But first, let me introduce Ugur for you. He's a professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at University of Amsterdam, and NIOD, you probably know, it's the Institute for War, Holocaust and Genocide Studies in Netherlands. And his latest book deals with paramilitarism, where he looks at the dynamics and relationships between paramilitaries and the state in several cases, from Kosovo to Iraq and Syria. And today he will talk about interventionism and cases of Iraq and Syria. And the reason for this urgency that we have today is that he has to leave and take part in the Independent Government Commission, which is dealing with atrocities, or rather international aid to paramilitaries. But I will leave that aside. Another important moment, it was just 2 days ago when Guardian published an article where entitled "Two Scholars Discover War Criminal in Syria." And of course, as you can imagine, the social media is exploding, and this is now a much discussed topic. This is something similar to what happened in Serbia with Scorpion's video that many of you already know. So there are several reasons why we want to hear Ugur and why we want to discuss with him right away, as he has to leave at 9:30 or 9:40. And we would like to use this time really that he is joining us, and then we continue as we planned with my introduction and all other speakers. So Ugur, please, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Katarina, for your introduction and for the invitation. It's great to be among all of you. I'm just going to share my screen. I have a few slides that I prepared. And what I will be doing is to address a topic that in no way can be addressed in the 15 minutes maybe that I have for this, namely the specter of interventionism in Syria and Iraq. And so one of the major, I think, research questions in looking at military interventions in the Middle East, but specifically in what we call the Mashriq, so the Eastern Mediterranean region, particularly Syria and Iraq, but we can look at it slightly broadly. For example, you can include Lebanon as well. Are 2 major questions. One is how and why were these interventions staged, and 2, what were the effects of these interventions on the ground? And I think that if you would go to the library and you would look up military intervention Iraq or military intervention Syria, then about 80% of anything that has been written about it in the media or in academia is about how the Americans felt about it. And so there's a kind of disregard actually for not only the agency, but also the impact that these interventions or non-interventions had on the ground. So what I want to do is give a very brief overview, and since I'm the first speaker, maybe it might make sense to give a little bit of a historical background, and then we'll look into Syria and Iraq comparatively and draw a small conclusion. And of course, everything always starts with the Ottoman Empire. So here too, I start with the Ottoman Empire because it is not that long ago, actually, that in the broader sense of things, that military political interventions by especially the great powers, of course, France, Britain, Russia, Germany, had a major impact on the former Ottoman Empire. In fact, the crumbling of the empire, and you can see here the lands that it once covered in orange, and then the lands that it was reduced to by 1914. Most of these the reduction of this territory, or this crumbling, was because of foreign intervention in combination with internal dissent and internal uprisings and protests. So those two things, those two kind of forces, when they met, for example, in Greece, of course, during the famous Greek uprising, they actually created the Greek nation state. So there's a long prehistory for these military interventions. And I'm mentioning this not only for kind of perfunctory historical background, but it's actually not that long ago. So there are individuals who I interviewed in the 2000s. These were former Ottoman Armenians. So these were Armenians living in Lebanon, who were in their 80s by then, and their grandparents remember a lot of these interventions, is what they told me. So, we're not speaking about ancient history here. This is actually, in the broader scheme of things, relatively recent. And this is a little bit of the backdrop for what we see later because of the continuity. Some of the arguments that were marshaled in this period, brilliantly researched by Davide Rodogno in his book on humanitarian intervention, or humanitarian interventionism. A lot of those arguments, actually, they find their ways through the colonial period, the post-colonial period, and well into the 21st century. And we'll look at that a little bit as well. Now, for our purposes, of course, here, Syria and Iraq, they were still under Ottoman control until 1914. That ended in 1918, and then we have the, of course, during the war, we have the Sykes-Picot Treaty. I'll get to that in a minute. But this history of military intervention has a number of not just comparisons, but continuities as well. So the 1820s, for example, in Greece, if you look at that, or the 1860s in Syria, the arguments marshaled, for example, in the British press, British politics across the aisle, was that there was a sad minority living in the Ottoman Empire, and we should go out there and protect these people from their own state, because their own state wasn't protecting them, or was assaulting them collectively and deliberately. Now, same arguments occurred in the Bulgarian horrors, quote unquote, and of course, by then we were already in the 1890s when the fate of the Ottoman Armenians began, deteriorating very, very rapidly, and that ended, of course, as we know, in the Armenian genocide of 1915. Now, after then, we have the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, the colonization of the rest of its lands, either in mandates or in direct colonies, or in kind of vassal states. But there are four important elements that mark this particular period, and this is the prehistory of those military interventions in the Cold War, post-Cold War period. First of all, there's a very, very clear selectivity to the individuals, the groups on which behalf the interventions are happening. So these victims, but not those victims. So I had to take a look at the 1860s, for example, in Syria, the Maronites and the Druze. They're basically going at it, and France was enraged that their clients, basically the Maronites, Christians, Eastern Christians, were not protected, or that they suffered, with no regard, for example, to the violence being committed by the Maronites against the Druze. So the interventions were necessarily selective. And that's maybe the only way also they could have been effective and explained to their own constituencies and to the British public. But a very clear selectivity in which victims, on behalf of which victims are we intervening. And here is a very important continuity of what we see much later on, 100 years later. We see this selectivity that, in my opinion, is still rock solid when we look at military and humanitarian interventions. Second is, of course, the glaring hypocrisy. There's a lot of talk, of course, about the inequities of empire and hypocrisy. So right in the exact same period that France is denouncing all of this violence that the Ottomans are committing, they are conducting a scorched earth campaign in the inner Algerian lands. The third one is the paternalism. So the Maronites, for example, that I already mentioned, or for example, Russia with the Armenians. The notion that there's a great power should be taking care of one of the minorities in the Ottoman Empire or any other empire. This is also across, for example, the African continent or in South Asia. This notion of international patronage actually had profound consequences on the ground. because groups that lived, or nominal groups that lived in coexistence, even if that's uneasy coexistence of multi-ethnicity in all those cities in the Ottoman Empire, they now started seeing each other like who is being protected by whom and who is a client of which patron state. So these macro cleavages actually found their way into these neighborhoods, which meant that in the 1890s up to 1915, when Turks were killing Armenians, they actually thought that they were fighting the Russian Empire also, because Armenians as clients of the Russian Empire, when you're fighting Armenians, you're fighting the empire. And finally, of course, the notion of racism, the notion that intervention civilizes the region, that it brings, for example, civilization as on a broad societal level. So the idea that a sultanate and that a caliphate, that these are really medieval notions. The idea that this multi-ethnic empire doesn't make sense. And, there's no legibility in terms of nation states. So make a proper nation state, quote unquote, like Greece, then we can talk to you. And then you are part of the same European nation state system, which is seen as a civilized form of politics. So, and that's beyond, of course, the racial hierarchies that were created beforehand and also in retrospect. So there would have been, for example, the French intervention retroactively or retrospectively legitimized the intervention through like racist notions that, for example, Middle Eastern Christians were parties that you could talk to. But the irrationality of Middle Eastern Muslims or Ottoman Muslims was that you can't really talk to these people. They don't make any sense. They sit cross-legged on the ground and they smoke water pipe and whatnot. So these notions, they were widespread, and you can find them actually when you go into. So David Rodonio, he has looked into these policy documents, and he's found glaring examples of this type of racism. Now, this of course all ends up in the master plan of the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916. So during the war already, the great powers, they kind of conspire to carve up the Ottoman Empire after the war. So they don't, so the argument is not, okay, we're having a war, we'll see how this war ends, we'll make peace, and the empire can exist, that country can exist as it is, and we will exist as we are, and we'll pick up the pieces. That's not what we're dealing with here. We're dealing here with a partition and colonization of this empire. So there was an independent Armenia in the yellow, was foreseen with a really strange western border here that goes straight to my mother's village, by the way. And then we have, of course, the zones of control, the red and blue ones, and the zones of influence. So, and you can already see almost the shape of Syria and this characteristic triangle shape of the country under French mandate, and then this bizarre shape of Iraq that looks really like a uterus, if you ask me, this B. And there you also see this trapeze-shaped Iraq. So all of this is not that long ago and had a profound impact on also the collective memory of Syrians and Iraqis, because, and here we go, the Troupes Spéciales du Levant, this was a French-supported Syrian paramilitary group that really was instrumental for the French army to occupy, to control, and to create also sectarian and ethnic hierarchies, because the French disproportionately recruited from minorities, or what they thought were minorities. And the concept of minority also, of course, it's not an unproblematic concept that can be used in an absolute way. And these colonial wars, they're of course different from other wars because they're civilizational wars. The Geneva Conventions or whatever Hague Conventions, they don't apply here. And that was also shown on the battleground. The first time that the city of Damascus was ever bombed from the air was by the French in 1925. I remind this sometimes. I remind my Syrian friends of this sometimes, because they will often say this is unprecedented that Assad is bombing Damascus with fighter jets. And I said, well, that's not unprecedented, actually. These people have learned it from somewhere. And there are preambles of it. And so and this is not that long ago. Again, I would like to stress that. Now let's do a little comparison, kind of juxtaposition of military interventions in Iraq and in Syria. Now let's start with Iraq. and this is mostly so U.S. military intervention with or without coalition. And we look at the 1970s, really, as military and intelligence interventions in Iraq were such that really among the Iraqi political spectrum, or let me put it this way, in the entire Middle East, the Communist Party was the strongest in Iraq, which also made it the strongest threat of takeover of the state or of wielding power. This is only like 5-6 years after the 1965 genocide in Indonesia, which the US supported. And so, of course, there was a vested interest in supporting the rivals of the Communist Party, and the Ba'ath Party was the major rival because they were fiercely anti-communist. So there's a lot of evidence that in military and intelligence support to the Ba'ath Party and even to Saddam Hussein, they were supported, and which amplified and made their influence in Iraqi politics disproportionate. So much so that in the end, of course, in 1979, Saddam Hussein could seize power and basically set up an deeply authoritarian, personalized regime. That is a military intervention. And then in the 1980s, of course, the Iran-Iraq war, Saddam invaded Iran with explicit green light by the US, and then the US armed them with chemical weapons, chemical warheads. Some of the chemicals were sold to Saddam Hussein by a Dutch businessman who was on trial, and I think he was released a couple of years ago. As far as I know, he's still alive, by the way. That is a military intervention right there, right? Supporting one side. Yeah, they also sold weapons to Iran, but not to the extent as they supported fully the Iraqi army, intelligence, special troops, air force, etc. And then in the 1990s, that's when things go south, because so far the violence that the Iraqi government, that Saddam regime committed, was permissible. And so the genocide of the Kurds was permissible violence. The invasion of another sovereign country like Iran was permissible. What was not permissible is the invasion of Kuwait. That transgressive violence was punished by, well, the first really Gulf War, if you don't count the Iran-Iraq war as a Gulf War, and an astounding tonnage of bombs was dropped on Iraq in this period. That is a profound military intervention, obviously, a direct military intervention against Iraq. Then we have, of course, well, this is all familiar, the war on terror, the occupation in 2003, and a profound de-democratization of Iraq. So forget about the massive military might, the unnecessary destruction of civilian infrastructure, the abolishment of the Iraqi army, with all of these military interventions, but also the de-democratization. So military intervention, if it is followed by military occupation, as it was in Iraq, then that leads to, or that often leads to, de-democratization, to the extent that the gentleman on this photo here, Paul Bremer, not only was he kind of autonomous head of the CPA, of the Coalition Provisional Authority, but also the Iraqis would make fun of him because Saddam had this paramilitary group called the Fedayeen Saddam, those who sacrificed themselves for Saddam. And then they would make fun of Bremer, who would always travel around with this massive security detail, and they would call him Fedayeen Bremer. And then, of course, we end up in 2010, the Arab Spring, the rise of ISIS, and then what Dexter Filkins has called the Forever Wars. In essence, we're dealing with, and there was a good piece on, there was a mini documentary of like 10 minutes that summarized 60 years of US military intervention in Iraq. And that is quite unprecedented, actually. There are very few other countries who, outside Vietnam, maybe a few others, that have counted on so much direct and indirect military interventions. Now, this brings me to Syria. Syria has a very different situation because the way that the country was intervened in was mostly indirectly by supporting the Israeli army, with which Syria had, they fought 4 wars, and Syria lost them all, including the one that is losing currently, because the Syrian airspace basically is fair game to the Israeli Air Force. So in that proxy war, that is really what that can be seen as an indirect military intervention into Syria, because it meant that by arming Israel to the teeth, really in a way also regimes before the Assad regime, so non-Ba'athist governments also saw themselves, they saw it necessitating the amping up military expenditure. That's exactly what happened. So at some point, Syria had the highest percentage of military expenditure in the entire Middle East. That includes Egypt and includes Turkey. Yeah, those are pretty militaristic countries historically. So that goes on until the 1990s. Then we have the war on terror, 9/11, and Syria becomes a site of extraordinary rendition. So I should mention this because so a gentleman like this one, for example, this is Mahad Arar, this picture, who was a Syrian Canadian citizen who was arrested on JFK, and then he was basically handed over in the explicit knowledge by the Americans that he would be tortured. So they sent him to Damascus, and he ends up in a prison of the military intelligence. The military intelligence are those same people that we exposed a couple of days ago. And so that is, in my opinion, a direct intervention by supporting an institution like the military intelligence, by keeping lines open between them, by having meetings and conferences with them in Beirut. This is nothing else than a military intervention and an amplification of the power of the military intelligence within Syria. Now, it gets really interesting, of course, with the current conflict in Syria, because, I mean, in a nutshell, the US especially intervened in Iraq. It shouldn't have, and it didn't intervene in Syria, and it should have. But when the use of chemical weapons was discussed in early 2013, Obama famously issued a red line. And so again, there's permissible and impermissible violence. So conventional weapons, you can do whatever you want, bomb your country with that, but you can't use chemical weapons. And so the idea of protecting victims, for example, was almost entirely abandoned, in my opinion. Just the use of the types of weapons was prioritized here and seen as a pretext or as an argument for intervention. That, of course, never happened. So that was, in a way, not a green light, not a red light, not a red line, but a green light. I almost said red light zone, but that's something else. And of course, and then in 2014, the next year, we see in a small coalition, but really the US-led intervention against Islamic State. Here, this is really the key argument here. We see expedient and tiresome enemies in Syria. The US intervenes against ISIS, which hasn't made, according to most recent estimation, the Assad regime has killed 17 times more civilians than ISIS. And yet, in 2014, the direct intervention is against degrading, I think Obama said, degrading the capacity of the Islamic State. And it was only really until Trump that some installations of the Assad regime were hit, and they were hit with direct missiles. And Syrians were then joking, one of these missiles was like $20 million. If you give us those $20 million, we'll demolish whatever you want in the country for you. So that's more or less the kind of the difference between one of the differences between Syria and Iraq is in Iraq we have the permissible and impermissible violence. In Syria we see roughly the same, but it's mostly about expedient enemies such as ISIS, which is a perfect enemy, and then tiresome enemies like Assad, which gave Obama headaches. Basically, he wasn't interested in intervening against it for various reasons. I mean, not another war in the Middle East, and also so fear of cold water, as we say in Dutch, because of the Iraqi war. In fact, there's a famous proverb in Syria that goes, if you burn your lips and your tongue on hot milk, then the next time you will blow into the cold yogurt. So that's basically what happened. So if Iraq was the hot milk, and Syria was the cold yogurt that they blew into and they shouldn't have. Then, nice coincidence, I'm in a government commission that investigates the non-lethal assistance that the Dutch government gave to the Syrian rebels between 2015 and 2018. There's a website, this is all public information, but that concept of NLA, so non-lethal aid, that's interesting because this is a military intervention. You know, it's support to rebels. Just it's not weapons. It's not bullets. It's not bombs. So it's not lethal intervention, but it is a military intervention. And that stretches the idea of the non-intervention principle in international law. All countries are sovereign. You're not supposed to intervene into another country, but then this is stretched in this way, and that's going to be an interesting discussion. The report of our commission will be out in September. So if you're interested, you can take a look at that. I think it's relevant to this discussion. So, conclusion. There are four important elements, common factors, I think, in these interventions. One is protection of civilians, of the right type of civilians or the wrong type of civilians. So the Maronites in the 1860s or the Kurds in the 1990s. There's a notion of liberation, the idea that Syria and Iraq are suffering populations that need to be liberated from outside. And there's a strong World War II element and prism through it. Third, the idea of civilization. This is a profoundly gendered concept, really, namely that, yeah, Muslim women, they suffer in these societies, they need to be liberated, civilized. The Iraqis have a backward culture, it's a tribal culture. We should go in there and basically change, liberate these people, give them education, give them infrastructure. But of course, the problem was that that same education, healthcare infrastructure, civilian infrastructure was destroyed by the US through either direct bombing or through sanctions. So, and it becomes a catch-22. You go in there, you destroy the civilian infrastructure, then you say, well, these people don't have civilian infrastructure, we should intervene. So, you know, that's an interesting circular reasoning. And finally, the notion of regime change, of course, the ideological notion that these are dictatorships and we should get rid of them. And this is used by arguments both on the left and on the right in various reasons, various different arguments. But so these are the four, I think, that are common. There was a lot of post-colonial critique as well. So the notion, I already said it, in Iraq, the US intervened militarily and it shouldn't have. It was unnecessary, it was false pretense, Colin Powell, all that stuff. And in Syria, it didn't intervene. The world called for it. Under the watchful eye of YouTube, you could watch Syrian children choking from chemical weapons. So it should have intervened, but it didn't. So there we go. Both sides of the equation have their problems, and in this comparison, it shows some differences, but also shows some similarities. Thank you.
Well, thank you first for providing this longer history and reminding us that it is still in living memory of people, all those interventions from 19th century till today, that it is not something which is forgotten on the ground, which is often forgotten when we talk about interventions in post-Cold War period. And as we have only 10 minutes, I would right away open the floor for questions regarding the interventions, regarding the principles that Hugo mentioned. So as we saw, selectivity seems to go always in.
There's one question online.
Yeah, Teresa. Teresa, please.
Yes, you're very fast. Thank you. Thank you, Katarina. Yes, I have a couple questions. Just, I mean, maybe these will seem like very simple questions or straightforward ones, but I was wondering, when you're speaking about interventions in the intervention in Kuwait, Desert Storm, with regard to why did the United States invade in that case and not intervene in the case of Iran. I was wondering, since you're making it clear that it's not really about necessarily morals or values, but instead about interests, what were the reasons, as far as you think? Why was that the red line when the United States had to intervene? And this is really going to sound like a very simple question, but it's actually, as far as I've been able to perceive, not that simple. I'm sorry to tell you that most Americans don't know why Iraq was invaded in 2003. A lot of people will say it's because of 9/11, but of course there was no connection there. The weapons of mass destruction excuse was presented to everybody, but turned out to be false and a lie. So why do you think that really happened? Why did that intervention, why was it undertaken by the Bush government, really? I can't even really find straightforward information on this now, and I've been interested in it because it's such a crazy thing. So that's my question for you, and thank you for your presentation, which was really interesting.
Well, thank you very much for the question. So we only have a few minutes, right? So that's a really big question. The second one, I'll start with the first one. So it would be great to do actually a comparative research project on why the invasion of one sovereign country like Iran was, and how it was discussed in, for example, among the US, but also in Europe, among political elites and among diplomats, for example, leadership, and how it was, and how that contrasts with Kuwait. I mean, one obvious question is that Kuwait, of course, was a Western ally, right? So even Kuwait is not a NATO, obviously, but it is an ally, and it has very strong ties politically, economically, and also historically to a number of different Western states, including obviously Britain, but also the later US from the 70s onward. So the invasion of Kuwait was seen as a slap in the face of a friend. So that's one obvious thing. And then the argument, not ad absurdum, but at oil is, I think, partly true, but we have to be careful, I think, of this kind of reductionist notion that everything that the US does in the Middle East is about oil. It isn't. This is really very much also about sovereignty. It's about allies. It's about upholding these alliances. So I think that's one answer on Kuwait and Iran. And of course, ideological one, because Iran is a dictatorship. Yeah, well, has anyone looked at how Kuwait does in the transparency meters and on the democratic indicators? So that is a blatantly hypocritical argument. But I think the alliance element is and that's relevant because also in 2003 invasion, there were no weapons of mass destruction. They knew it, and it was a pretext. But what is interesting is to look, that's why I mentioned continuity in my talk quite a bit. So what does the 1860s have in common with the 2020s, for heaven's sake? But it's important to look at continuities because they can elucidate quite a bit. And the 2003 invasion, if we look at the staff, so not only obviously, George W. Bush, but almost everybody around him, his major advisors which recently in this really good book that I read about the war on terror was this cabal of people like Cheney and Rumsfeld, and a number of other people who were less famous than Cheney and Rumsfeld, who gravitated around them, who basically felt they had almost a civilizational mission, and also resentment from not doing the right thing back in the 1990s. And so a lot of those people were relatively young. Now they were in power. So those two things I think are much more important. So the collective biography really of this leadership, I think the explanations are there. And also, let's not forget also a profoundly naive idea that of regime change as an ideological phenomenon. So if you don't understand you don't understand this dictatorship, you have no idea how you're going to turn it to a democracy. You intervene there, and then you fire all of the civil servants because you say, well, they were members of the Ba'ath Party. Yeah, but don't you know that membership of the Ba'ath Party was mandatory for those who want to become a civil servant, right? So I mean, if you haven't done your basic research, then why you just victimized 500,000 people by sending them home with no salary?
Thank you. That's really interesting. And like you said, we could probably talk about this for quite some time. So thank you.
I have only one more question. So our keynote speaker from yesterday, Jan, just a quick question. The 1924's French intervention in Syria, in Damascus, is the May Saloon episode significant?
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Professor Nederveen. I mean, it's a profoundly important intervention because before that, so the Ottoman Empire was in charge of that region for 600 years. In those 600 years, roughly, the first time that non-Ottoman military boots were on the ground was when the French, basically, when they landed in 1924. So it was almost for them a modern political crusade in that let's say how to put it, the deflowering of Ottoman lands. The idea that we're finally now there's a different player in town. It's a watershed in the history of French interventionism, which is, of course in the Mediterranean has a long history. but also again for the locals. If you look at how Syrians reacted to this, it was from the very beginning, extremely negative. All right, so the first Syrian uprising is in 1925. It's not that the Syrian political elite just waited. They waited. They gave the French a chance for a decade. Let's see how they do. No, from the very beginning, it was, this is not what we want at all. And so Elizabeth Thompson has written a recent book, How the West Stole Democracy from the Arabs, in which she argues actually a kernel of compromise and consensus building and democratic culture. There was a kernel there a kernel of a democratic political culture burgeoning among the Syrian political elite in the 1920s. And that was immediately quashed by the French. So, and that explains a lot, because they have 20 years, they're in charge, they leave, and the state infrastructure that they leave behind with their intelligence agencies, with their military airports and whatnot, all of that within 15 years is taken over by Assad. And then he starts running the country like the French did, basically. Authoritarian, minoritarian, sectarian, violent.
Thank you very much. I'm so happy we recorded this and that we could get you here and heard your talk. So yes, very much. Thank you, and I hope we continue discussion.
Thank you. Have a nice workshop, and I will listen to Christian later because he won't record it. Good luck, Christian. Thanks, Vlado, and thank you, Katarina. Bye, everyone.
Okay, so we are now out of this emergency mode, and it's a little bit awkward that I go back to my presentation to introduce the panel, but I will do it nevertheless. Okay, so just a quick intro. When I started preparing this panel, my idea was delegitimization of NATO interventions, because US and NATO was withdrawing from Iraq, and then Putin's attack happened. So I kind of reframe it right away. And if you see the abstract, I reframe it following the concept of crisis that Matthias Vidal introduced at the first day of conference, saying crisis, it is with the rhetoric which makes possible for different actors to reduce complexity into very simply binary distinctions. And this is exactly what I did. I say, okay, here let's have a look at interventions. We actually have a very clear kind of binary between illiberal interventions and those liberal or those building liberal international order. As this was happening very quickly in February, I'm very grateful to all panelists who found the time and who could join to this discussion, because really the idea comes from a broader global studies perspective, and that means we want to look not only at the long historical processes, but we also want to look at different cases and how they relate to this kind of common idea or common practice of interventions. And you already heard Ugo, so I won't introduce him again, but I will introduce other speakers, starting with Christian Axbo Nielsen, whose next book is still in print, but this is the first look to the covers. And the book is, as you see, Mass Atrocities and the Police, and that is a longer history of ethnic cleansing in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Christian has been writing a lot on the topic of Yugoslavia, wars in Yugoslavia. He was also an expert witness in the ICTY, but that is another story. And he had a great argument, a great paper about how Russia has been using this kind of Kosovo president in its own international politics. And this is what he is going to talk about today, also adding not only the case of Georgia, but also adding Ukraine. Our next speaker would be Vladimir Pedrovich, and Vladimir has also, who is from Boston University and also from Belgrade University, and he has been really also doing huge research on wars in former Yugoslavia, on transitional justice. But my absolute favorite is his book on ethnic cleansing, which follows historically the concept from religious cleansing till the most recent, or what we understand under ethnic cleansing, which was actually coming into debate in 90s, during the 90s war in Yugoslavia. And today he is going to talk about different modes of interventionism, basically focusing on American interventionism. As I think that Edna is not here, I will simply skip the introduction because that seems oh, she's here. Edna, oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, it's great that you are here. I didn't see it. So then we are very happy. Actually, Edna will talk between Christian and Vladimir, because after Christian, we will have, I would say, a very nice historical overview of interventions on one hand in Iraq and Syria, what we already heard, and then we will hear a little bit more about Russian interventions in Georgia and Ukraine. And then I think it is really a nice place to discuss a little bit concepts. And Edna is an expert working on a norm, on computations of norms, especially dealing with humanitarian interventions. And she was writing and publishing a lot on rights to protect. And today she's going to talk about new sovereignty as responsibility. And that is, here you have an example. She wrote an excellent article in this Routledge handbook on responsibility in IR. And of course, we will end then with Vladimir Pedrovich talk on interventionism and especially in the case of Yugoslavia. So just a few words about the idea of the panel. And here you see the idea was actually simply to go against this simplistic notion of globalization as a never-ending natural process, which is bringing always more connections and always increasing this connectedness among different participants, and to think instead in the concepts of contested projects where different ideas, different norms, different principles are coming together and are taken by different actors who are reacting or rejecting or trying to cope with the current global condition. And here you have a quote from a book which was published in 1998 by Jan Leder and Peters. And I think that it captures really why was this moment of humanitarian intervention so important, because it was really the praxis wasn't new. And if you heard Ugo's talk, then you really can go into the 19th century and find very similar practices. But it was humanitarian interventions as they were envisioned in the 90s were really attacking or changing or attempting to change what was perceived as global architecture, what was perceived as a relation of power between the states or architecture of states, what was the nature of politics, and the role of armies, and I would say most importantly, the meaning of sovereignty. And all those points are playing into this question, or rather into the discussion of why interventions gain such a prominent kind of role in our discussions today. And just a few words, and I won't bother a lot with this because I really want to hear our speakers, but just to frame the debate. So we have this common idea that when we talk about humanitarian interventions, we are actually looking at the division between human rights and sovereignty. So this is the dilemma, right? And intervention is done or conducted once the human rights reasons prevail. Chandler's criticism is well known as saying that this is depoliticizing, that this moral argument are completely missing the whole political, economical, and all other dimensions which have to be included into the equation. But instead, what we have is this kind of idealistic talk of human rights, which is then meeting military interventions. Sovereignty, which was under attack in this kind of interventions, was not only resolved. And actually, there are scholars claiming that we have seen in the 90s emergence of a new sovereignty or humanity with the capital H, as Maslish called it. And he was really looking at the whole kind of this liberal international system of institutions, of humanitarian interventions, of relation between the states, which is establishing this kind of new world order, which will deal differently with mass atrocities, with atrocities like genocide, crimes against humanity, and so on. And from here comes this simplistic binary idea of two globalization projects. One, which I called liberal internationalism, building on Moravcik's idea of liberalism in international relation theory, basically claiming that it is international cooperation, it is institutions which are regulating, it is new from institutions from International Criminal Court, so tribunals for Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and so on and so forth, number of such institutions, and supported by scholars working in transitional justice, by media, by human rights NGOs, and so on. What was, I would say, or what is actually new or not that new is to think about illiberal interventions, or I call it wrongly liberal nationalism, and I know several of you would react to this, of those who actually conceive a very different idea of the global order. And this is the idea of sovereignty, which trumps any other concern, of ability to use excessively violation, to go against its own population without much concern of any moral, legal, political, or any other concerns, and to claim that sovereignty is the main principle, which is to be upheld. And this might look in the contradiction with the intervention, which is then breaching someone else's sovereignty, but then here sovereignty is understood as sovereignty of people and not sovereignty of states. So it is, again, it is an attempt which is, it has its own logic, in that the logic shouldn't be missed when we think about this kind of interventionism. And points of departure for the whole panel was the idea that actually Kosovo intervention was some kind of watershed. So my main reasons why, because before we have interventions which are, and I'm talking about post-war period, which are upheld by UN Security Council, or we have complete tolerance for mass atrocities within the state. So sovereignty within the state is absolutely protected or respected. After NATO intervention in Kosovo, neither of this is the case. And then we have many other different interventions, ones that we can follow NATO in war on terrorism, and the other in Russian interventions as we see it in Georgia and Ukraine. So this was the whole idea. These are some questions that I hope that our panelists would speak to. Some dealing with principles, some with empirical cases, some with questions of how they relate to each other. But I would say now I stop.
Thank you so much, Katarina, and thank you for a wonderful panel and opportunity to discuss with you these very interesting topics. And I'm really glad Christian finished on a very interesting notion that is also of great interest to me. And this is the question of how far you can go with opportunistic uses and ethical principles, because ultimately, of course, as we have seen also from Ugur's presentation, interest will not topple ethical principles will not necessarily topple pure naked interest. However, whatever happens, it needs to be accepted as legitimate by others. So ultimately, every hypocritical use that is drawing on genuine uses may undermine that very discourse that sustains it, that facilitates that hypocritical use. And this is in the focus of my research for a long time, on responsibility to protect, on the right to intervene, humanitarian interventions, and norm contestation. So this is what I have for today, to offer a few thoughts in this particular context. I'm going to share my slides with you. So it should be okay now. So it is exactly this ethical kind of fabric of international politics that interests me, and more specifically, how the use of particular ethical notions and ethical arguments have an impact, perhaps not immediate and perhaps longer term, impact on how we see international politics and how it shapes what is possible in international politics. So thank you so much, Katarina, for this interesting idea of naming the two globalization projects. I will run with it, the liberal internationalism and illiberal nationalism, as two of these globalization projects. What I would like to show you is that none of these are actually monolithic. So they have been coexisting in the 20th century, and both are still here because they are rooted in longer standing discourses, which also encapsulate certain ethical view of the world, ethical values and relationships. So one of them, the liberal internationalism, is linked to a cosmopolitan view of the world, which English school scholars would also call an existence of a global civil society, where the individual human being is a fundamental building block or the subject of political relations. And the other one is the communitarianist idea, where we would speak of a society of sovereign states, which obviously prioritizes the state as the main actor, the main subject of political relations. Now, both of these discourses, ethical ideas of the world have been responses to particular challenges. They have been embedded in different practices, and very importantly, they represent enduring values, which is why they are still here and they are still resilient. So the normative background for the Cosmopolitan project is the appearance of the individual human being as a subject in international law, and this has several precedents. In the aftermath of the First World War, which generated a huge wave of refugees, especially from Russia and the territory of the Russian Empire, and the appearance of national minorities made it so that international law is first confronted with the figure of the unprotected alien, which is the stateless people, who at the time were a perfectly anomalous phenomenon in the current political order. Then in the 40s, the Nuremberg trials and later on the Geneva Conventions recognized also the individual both as a victim and as perpetrator. Then in the 1950s, as a continuation of refugee regime, the UNHCR, the High Commissioner for Refugees, the Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees is created in order to provide substitute protection for those that left their country of nationality for fear or actual persecution. In the 90s, we see the human rights regime emerging, although its civilian and political rights aspect or orientation only appeared later. There is excellent scholarship that shows how much this has been, human rights have been embraced by countries in the non-aligned movement, which placed an emphasis on economic and social rights. And then later on in the 90s, we see a regime emerging to protect internally displaced people in ongoing conflicts, and later the guidelines emerging, being integrated in the work of the UN. And again, in the 90s, we see the development of international criminal justice, which again reinforces the individualization of war. So these are all practices that speak to the idea that that world politics is actually played within a global civil society, that the human being, the individual human being matters. It should have enjoyment of rights. At the same time, on the other hand, the normative background or the discourses and practices that feed the illiberal nationalist globalization project is, of course, the central notion of the nation state, a deeply European project that became then globalized throughout the 20th century, as you well know, emerging as a dominant political formation that is desired and recognized, not just from the early 20th century Wilson's notion of self-determination, national self-determination, but later on reinforced in the process of decolonialization, and then also reinforced by a strict interpretation of non-intervention and non-interference, as a result of which throughout the Cold War until the early 90s, no intervention was justified with humanitarian concerns or considerations. Now, both of these globalization projects and both of these discourses and practices, one having the human being at its core and the other one having the state at its core, actually have a corresponding notion of what is responsible sovereignty and what is responsible behavior in international politics when it comes to military interventions. And very briefly, we could say perhaps that the cosmopolitan version or vision of world order would put emphasis on responsible sovereignty, whereas the communitarian would emphasize the sovereignty aspect, responsible sovereignty. However, they understand what responsible sovereignty means in very different ways. And I'm zooming on responsible sovereignty because with the emergence of not just the responsibility to protect, but its forerunning discourses, that is actually the father of that notion. Francis Deng is a Sudanese diplomat who has been working not just with African politics, but also internally displaced people, mostly in Africa, and then becoming the first special representative of internally displaced people, actually all over the world. And he was the first person who coined that idea that actually sovereignty should imply responsibilities. And then from the responsibility to protect history, you know well that this idea has been incorporated into the R2P discourse and later on gained wide acceptance and support. And this is how it gained a particular notion and meaning within the context of interventions. So coming back to the two globalization projects, what I wanted to say is that once it came to applying R2P, also the interpretation of what responsible behavior means were tainted or shaded by these two discourses, the cosmopolitan or liberal international vision and the communitarian, which prioritized the nation state. And for the first one, since it envisages global civil society, the responsibility means an answerability by the state for the conduct towards its own population, meaning that the state needs to be embedded in relations of responsibility and answerability externally for how it treats the human beings that live on its territory. Whereas in the second discourse, globalization project, the emphasis is much more put on the reinforcement of sovereign state as the bearer of responsibilities. So in this vision of world order, order itself is only guaranteed if we have orderly states, strong states that can actually prevent state collapse, prevent the collapse of public order, and therefore the notion of responsibility is very much tainted to the subject, the bearer of responsibilities, and therefore a reinforcement of sovereign statehood. To make it a bit more practical, I would like to show you some illustrations of responsible sovereignty within these two discourses from my own research in the context of the 2011 Libyan intervention. And I would like to do so by zooming out a little bit of the current context that we are looking at. So neither the Russian aggression in Ukraine nor the Western uses and abuses of justifications of military intervention, but a different context. So I'm comparing NATO discourse leaders, both country leaders within NATO and also NATO per se, and the African Union in the context of the Libyan intervention. So what I would like to illustrate with this is how this understanding of responsible sovereignty is depicted, and also how it actually shows the cosmopolitan communitarian ethical perspective. So I'm quoting from Sarkozy saying that protecting civilians from the murderous madness of Gaddafi's regime is a priority. And on the other hand, you have the African Union that says the proliferation of arms emanating from the Libyan depots and the risk that this situation poses for regional and continental peace and stability is of ultimate concern, says its Peace and Security Council. And this is what triggers responsibility. So if you look at it, you see that on the one hand, the responsibility is triggered by the murderous madness of a regime. On the other, the concern that state collapse and its implication may imply for regional and continental peace and stability. Again, from NATO, if we intervene alongside Arab countries, it is not to impose a final outcome on the Libyan people, but in the name of universal conscience, which cannot tolerate such crimes. On the other hand, you see the African Union's position, which says it's important to undertake every effort to protect civilians and public institutions, to maintain law and order, and to promote national reconciliation and unity. Again, NATO representing the cosmopolitan vision, when the leader's only means of staying in power is to use mass violence against its own people, he has lost the legitimacy to rule. So these kind of arguments, that was also an op-ed published by Obama, David Cameron, and Sarkozy, arguing that Gaddafi has lost the legitimacy to rule. It put NATO in a self-contradicting position in which they were actually advocating regime change, falling short of calling it a regime change. And then you see the other perspective, sparing no efforts to facilitate a peaceful solution within an African framework. So again, emphasizing the role of negotiations, not demonizing one side or the other, and then advocating for the lead for African actors who are actually bearing the brunt of any consequences of state collapse and the implications of continental peace and stability. And then we can go a little bit further, illustrating these two notions, these two broader discourses that provide the ethical core or the ethical heart of the two globalization processes. And these are quotes from the R2P debates from the General Assembly. There have been mostly informal debates and recently formal debates at the General Assembly on how to bring the concept forward. And then you see France arguing that the role of R2P is to prevent the most heinous crimes, whereas the Russian Federation arguing that this is an artificial simplification of the situation in black and white terms, to claim that the danger for citizens comes from their own governments. Again, France arguing in the context of these debates that in these situations, coercive measures are indispensable in forcing a government to protect its population, again, talking about the use of force, about coercion, or in certain circumstances, our collective responsibility entails resorting to force to stop massacres. On the other hand, the Russian Federation arguing in these debates that armed intervention led to serious worsening of the situation, increase in civilian suffering, and paralysis of state institutions. And then it already talks about the number of consequences from spread of weapons and instability within the countries and in the region at large. So these discourses actually appear to be competing with each other, but since are both legitimate, they endure. So they the whole idea behind R2P was, and its pillar-based structure, that first there is the state responsibility, and then should the state fail to protect its own population, and also assistance from other states fail. In the case of this manifest failure, the international community can and should intervene. The whole idea was to kind of create a reconciliation between these two arguments, which most of the time seem to be the opposite side of the coin. However, these two discourses have been, in some cases, such as in the case of the practice of the African Union, have been institutionalized at the same time. So you see the Constitutive Act of the African Union saying that there is a right of the Union to intervene in a member state pursuant to a decision of the Assembly in respect of grave circumstances, namely war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity. So you see the cosmopolitan idea appearing here, hand in hand with the communitarian idea, where the African Union stipulates that member states can request intervention from the Union to strengthen themselves, and also that the Union will not tolerate unconstitutional changes of governments, which again is a certain normative vision that is supposed to reinforce the sovereign state as the bearer of responsibilities. So why have I been talking about this particular context and distancing or putting the Russian uses of and abuses of Balkan analogies and other R2P related ethical justifications for its intervention? Because I wanted to show that there are actually a lot of legitimacy involved in both. Both can be abused and abused, so both can be used for cynical, hypocritical purposes, and both that represent a particular range. So the illiberal nationalist discourse can display a behavior by the African Union that promotes negotiations with Gaddafi, but at the same time, its abuse may represent what we see as Russia's justification for the war in Ukraine. So let's go back a little bit to that context, zooming in again. Again, I'm not suggesting that what Russia is currently choosing as justifications are actually a representation of the illiberal national project. It can be, as Christian also convincingly argued before me, an opportunistic use, and I will talk a little bit more about the normative consequences of that. But first, a few thoughts on the Russian aggression. It has been puzzling from many respects, and not just because of the general prohibition of the use of force in the post-Second World War world order, but also from the perspective of the Russian discourse itself, because the Russian domestic experience in the 1990s, going towards a democratic transition and the capitalist transition, have resulted in a very painful and very costly social experience, what Sergei Prozorov calls bespredel, so the experience of the complete and total lawlessness. Also then the Kosovo intervention in the international sphere showed a very heightened understanding of Russia, of betrayal by breaching international law by the Western actors. So from the perspective of the Russian discourse, both on the domestic and the international level, breaching these rules themselves has been contradictory to what Russia professed and the normative arguments that Russia has been normally putting forward at the United Nations Security Council and in general other forums, which represented a very strictly legalistic view. It is also a puzzle in terms of the breach of the sovereign borders on the territory of the former Soviet Union, which is actually affirmed in the regional security organizations in the region, such as the Collective Security Treaty Organization. And also it goes against Russia's criticism of the West for using force, although Christian has given excellent context for this already, how criticizing and using the template at the same time can go hand in hand. So I would like to come back to where I started. The ethical fabric of these globalization projects and these discourses matter, perhaps not in a sense of preventing Russia from intervening, but whatever Russia does and says will intervene in turn in these ethical discourses and will either reinforce or undermine them, depending on how others evaluate the legitimacy of these arguments. So what type of contestation this may lead to, so the justifications Russia chooses in terms of the context of these two globalization projects. So this is rather a question rather than an argument I'm asking myself and asking you also, whether Russia's justifications will be evaluated as the illiberal nationalist way of using force, reinforce the values incorporated in the discourse. I am not sure this is the case for the above mentioned opportunistic uses. But it may be the case that Russia will be supported in saying, if we can put the two things in parallel, is that the so-called cosmopolitan vision has found its way of using force to reinforce human rights, and it did so even by breaching the rules, meaning without Security Council authorization in Kosovo in 1999. So would that be matched by the illiberal nationalist use of force, so to say, whether it will be accepted as such? Or perhaps more likely, the Russian justifications will bring a confusion of these rules, or there is no paradigmatic use of justifications here, or it will not add up to a kind of coherent paradigm as illiberal nationalists within the illiberal nationalist global project. All it will do, it will be muddy further the waters. And my previous take on these Russian uses in terms of parody and others' take in terms of trolling point to the fact that Russia's opportunistic uses of these justifications will just simply create enough confusion that it will be hard to tell whether there is anything principled behind. It can be that the kind of contestation that will result in the current events is Russia being rejected, and then it will be the multipolar world order that it has been preaching for a long time, but it will be a multipolar world order in which the poles are disconnected from each other. So we will see, this is to be seen, whether the kind of order or disorder will follow. It will depend on how others will evaluate Russia's justifications. And a short thought on this, Africa, which I have mentioned before, that is very conscious of the non-breaching of sovereign borders for its own historical reasons, have actually in some official communication have been avoiding to calling Russian aggression in Ukraine and rather prefer to opt for calling it the Ukrainian crisis, which I find very interesting because there is no mention of Russia in what is happening. It's just the implications of the Ukrainian crisis on African prices, for instance. So I think this is very much under or in progress, this contestation, and I'm very curious to see how these two ethical ideas within these two globalization projects will kind of react to what is now happening in Ukraine. But thank you so much for your attention. I will stop here because I think I'm running out of time.
Thanks. I don't know where to start. Thanks for providing, for complicating the picture and challenging this idea that we are actually talking about some kind of ordered orders. And also for bringing in African Union, because this is really an excellent case to see how someone who is really standing aside from those European claims, how they actually struggle to formulate principles in different ways, or probably to use more than just one exclusivist way of thinking or arguing. But let's go to the final presentation and then I open for discussion. So Vladimir is here and he will talk about American interventionism. before he moves to Lviv, where he is now currently opening how is it called? Invisible University, Ukrainian University. So I see you can tell us something, few words about that, because this is, I heard, one can start university in 2 weeks. Is that true?
Well, yes and no. So firstly, let me greet you all. And then secondly, perhaps I might start with a confession. I mean, I do have a presentation on different modalities of American involvement in the Yugoslav crisis in the 90s, and I will run it with you briefly. But actually, I came here to learn, and I learned quite a lot from the previous conversations. So I hope if you wouldn't mind if I also act as a self-styled commentator to what I learned today. There are several issues that I'm prompted to speak about now. Since I got this invitation, I was really uneasy about it because the issue of military interventions is something which was for me extremely troubling from times immemorial. There are several reasons for that. Philosophically speaking, I'm a pacifist and definitely not a trigger-happy person. So therefore, for pacifists, the issue of humanitarian or non-humanitarian, liberal or illiberal interventions poses a tremendous challenge. And I felt it time and again. A second empirical reason is that way too often I found myself at the receiving end of such interventions. So in 1999, at the receiving end of a liberal intervention, and just the other day over the weekend, I'm going to Lviv to be at the receiving end of a illiberal military intervention. And that also gives one particular optics to what's happening. In response to Katarina's question, the initiative that she mentioned is called the Invisible University for Ukraine, and it was launched by a Central European university a couple of weeks ago with an idea to basically save the semester for those Ukrainian students who are displaced and have no access to their higher education, so that basically we can organize courses which will enable them to earn their credits for the rest of this semester. But it turned out to be an extremely moving experience because we have 150 students coming from all over Ukraine, and they are actually eager to learn, and we are eager to learn from them. So that's the rationale behind my visit to Lviv. What did I learn today? The issue which was for me always troubling in regard to military interventions was also, of course, the issue of a yardstick. And from Erna's presentation, I heard a lot about the importance of norms, no matter how hypocritical their actualization actually can be, because the norms are those which are limiting decision makers. They are in one way or another held accountable to what they are saying. I remember in regard to this pacifism and military interventions, if I can also clarify this a bit. I understand that there is an importance of exception to every rule. I'm flexible enough to understand that. For instance, I don't condone murder at all, but I wouldn't mind at all helping Stauffenberg to kill Hitler. In that same regard, my approach to these interventions is similar. So under the right conditions and under the right circumstances, probably this is something that can be ethically defended. If I can be a bit personal on that matter, back in 2013, or was it 14, I was at the panel with Professor Ungor, who unfortunately left us this morning, and the panel was devoted to the situation in Syria. And back then, I remember that he was arguing extremely forcefully for an immediate military action in order to curb Assad regime. And I remember that on the conference and afterwards, we went into a heated debate when I questioned what would be the outcome of it and what would be the nature of that involvement and what would be the exit strategy and all these seemingly practical things. He stuck to his guns, and I have to say that history probably had proven him right in that debate. That being said, it clearly opens up another question, which is the role of us as academics. What are we supposed to do? I mean, I'm extremely interested in politics as well, but the only reason I'm not doing politics is exactly to avoid making such decisions. I prefer to look at them and to analyze them from a safe and morally more strongly defendable position of an observer, because what I noticed is that basically, if you are in that line of occupation, some sort of killing is always on the table. Will it be put in practice or not? It's certainly a matter of historical situations, but basically, it's simply such line of occupation. And unfortunately, we need to scrutinize this and to come up with some sustainable and rational approaches to this matter. As a historian, I think I might contribute by scrutinizing one example, which gives us certain food for thoughts. And this is the example of the US involvement in the Yugoslav crisis. Why did I choose these examples among many others? Well, firstly, because I know it relatively well. And secondly, and more importantly, because this example shows way too many modalities of military and non-military interventions. So it allows us to come up with some conclusions by comparing different types of involvements that a major power or a superpower can have when confronted with a certain crisis. So now I will just really briefly take you to the presentation because I'm rather more interested in the discussion following this amazing panel. Let me start the slideshow. And if we take a look at how the US reacted in different stages of the Yugoslav crisis, for the most part during the 1990s, even though many people would probably argue that this crisis didn't even end yet, and probably Professor Nielsen would agree with me on that one, we can see that the US had tried out almost every conceivable way of intervening and non-intervening in that crisis. This is a haphazard way to do a periodization, and certainly it's contestable, but I will try it nonetheless. Yugoslavia started falling apart during 1990 and 1991. And in the first stages of its dissolution, the US mostly had the modality of a spectator. And then when the war started in Bosnia for real, it did get involved, but rather in a multilateral modality in cooperation with other NATO allies and in cooperation with Russia. From 1995 onwards, it took a leading role among the NATO country members, and it was managing different aspects of the Yugo crisis through some sort of Euro-Atlantic modalities. And then after the deposal of Milosevic, it fell back to promoting democracy as the way of exercising its influence in the region. And then in the period after 2010, and sorry for this typo, it basically switched to an alternative concept of sponsoring stabilocracies, which started emerging in that region. So basically, if we contrast and compare different aspects of this involvement, I think we can draw several conclusions, which I will briefly try to do. But prior to that, I will refresh your memory on how it actually looked like. So Yugoslavia is a country which is no more. It came about after the First World War. And as we heard from Professor Ungor, this is not such a distant history, and it actually matters in everyday life. More importantly for this conversation, Yugoslavia was a darling of the Cold War. Since Tito's fallout with Stalin in 1948, Yugoslavia was also a serious US investment. A lot of money, a lot of wheat, a lot of armament, including jet planes and so on. Tito met almost every US president, sorry, the Yugoslav president Tito met almost every US president until from Eisenhower to Carter. Here you see him laughing with Carter and then laughing with Eisenhower and so on. That all means that Yugoslavia was an investment, which also means that the US was fairly interested in keeping it together in 1989, 1990, and 1991 while it was falling apart. I want to emphasize that because, interestingly enough, in the region, predominantly in Serbia, but also elsewhere, conspiracy theories abound. And among those, the strongest one is that the US somehow decisively contributed to the collapse of Yugoslavia. Well, that is most absolutely not true, apart of the fact that probably through the lack of decisive action, the US might have contributed to the course of developments. But as I mentioned, the first reflex or the first modality of the US diplomacy when confronted with a crisis it couldn't understand easily and which didn't pertain to its national interest was not to do anything. Why? Well, firstly and foremostly, in 1990 and 1991, the US diplomacy had its hands full. The Soviet Union was falling apart. Prior to that, Eastern European bloc already fell apart. The Gulf War started, as we heard from Ur. So there were many fires to be controlled all over the world, and Yugoslavia was simply not a priority anymore. That was felt very, very hardly by the US Embassy in Belgrade and its ambassador at the time, Warren Zimmerman, who did something relatively unprecedented. So he saw that the country is falling apart, and he saw that the US really can't do much at this point or doesn't want to do much. And he tried literally to force the hand of his own government and did something that ambassadors rarely do. He did his best to get a national security assessment by the joint intelligence community about Yugoslavia. And that assessment came about in late 1990. You see it here by the title Yugoslavia Transformed. And it's very blunt. It says Yugoslavia will cease to function as a federal state within a year, will probably dissolve within 2, there might be war, and so on. Since nothing happened after that, after that assessment, the embassy actually leaked it to the New York Times. So basically, on November 28, 1990, the Yugoslavs, if they would read English, could read that their country will fall apart. And this was an attempt to basically force the higher ups into some sort of action. That action came about when State Secretary of the United States, James Baker, visited Yugoslavia in late spring, early summer, basically early summer of 1991. And he met with all the actors of the Yugoslav crisis. He listened to all of them. He gave a couple of statements. The statements went along the following lines. The United States supports territorial integrity of Yugoslavia. The United States support movements which are directed toward democratization of the system. And the United States will never support any solution which is imposed through the arms. The problem is that basically each of his interlocutors in that quarreling country heard exactly what they wanted to hear from that statement, which was pretty much loaded with contradictions in itself. Why was it loaded with contradictions? Well, really easy explanation. When he went back into the plane, Baker said to his underling, look, I listened to these people, we don't have a dog in this fight. So basically, it was explicated that the US is not going to be involved. Now, certainly the US at the time being the only superpower, or basically the chief player in town, this could not have been said publicly. So if you believe only the newspaper and if you don't look behind the curtains, you would hear that conflict is in Yugoslavia, war in Yugoslavia is feared by Baker, the US is ready to do this and the US is ready to do that. But basically behind the curtains, nothing much was happening, not only while the war in Croatia was on, but also when the war was spreading in Bosnia, so in 1991 and 1992. And I'm drawing your attention to the cover of this funny magazine from London, Private Eye. This is this sort of ironic take on the world's diplomacy on Bosnia. Bosnia latest, this is British Prime Minister John Major, who talks to Bush, the elder, back then the US president. He asks him, if you can't see, is it time to act? And Bush tells him, yeah, act concerned. So this was pretty much, and I don't mean to be cynical about it. There are certain reasons that the US positioned itself that way. This position was challenged very early on, and this brings me to Erna's take on the extreme importance of norms in international relations. As the news of the war crimes broke in the international media, which was the summer of 1992, and you see the scope of the crimes here on the cover of the Time magazine, it presented a huge challenge for the US administration. This is the outgoing Republican administration of George Bush, where Baker at a certain point ceased to be Secretary of the State, and the acting secretary was Lawrence Eagleberger, whom you can see here leaning on the door. He was also a person highly involved in the Yugoslav affairs and knowledgeable about it. He was an ambassador to Belgrade, and more importantly, he was up until his neck in business deals to sell some Yugoslav cars called Yugos, well known for their lack of efficiency, and he earned himself a nickname, Lawrence of Yugoslavia. So he knew the country, he knew what was happening. Therefore, in this case, ignorance can't really be a mitigating circumstance. Although I have to say that ignorance with the US officials sometimes really can be astounding, which is also understandable, having in mind that they have to meddle into the affairs of 191 states at the same time. Anyhow, war crimes become a matter of fact in 1992. The outgoing Bush administration, and especially Eagleberger, take quite a robust moral stand, saying that war crimes will never be forgiven, will never be forgotten, that the ethnic cleansers of our century are going to meet their fate. He even goes as far as to name names of people who are responsible. This was late 1992, and he goes into history. He ceases to be Secretary of the State, but somehow puts a strong benchmark to the US diplomacy in a rather delicate moment, because this was a time of the elections in the US as well. And as we all, of course, know, the inner politics matters tremendously in the formulation of foreign politics of any country, and particularly of the United States. In these elections, which were fought between Bill Clinton as a exponent of the Democratic Party, this was a team. And the inactivity of the US in Bosnia in particular was a major theme of this campaign. Why? Clinton was trying to force an image of a new force, of a new age type of a politician who takes ethical issues seriously, of somebody who is able to project this new role of the United States in a useful way. And inactivity of the previous administration was certainly a powerful argument to that end. Clinton, even when, especially when he became a president, was not deaf to that argument. We see him here opening the US Holocaust Memorial with Elie Wiesel, and that was a famous situation because Elie Wiesel used this moment to tell him that he had been in Bosnia as well and that he has seen horrible things and it's time to act. How to act? So basically, the first lesson that the US diplomacy took from the Yugoslav crisis was that actually not acting can be unsustainable and that not acting can also be damaging and expensive. Moving from whether to act to how to act was also extremely challenging. Clinton, during his presidential campaign, was offering an alternative to the US support of negotiations among the warlords in the former Yugoslavia. And this alternative was called lift and strike. Just to explain, somewhere by the end of Yugoslavia, the Security Council imposed an embargo on weapons trade to the Yugoslav region. So there was a standing embargo on importing armament into Yugoslavia. And he said, well, you see, these negotiations which are happening within the framework of United Nations and European Community, soon to become European Union, by the way, they are sort of a dead-end thing. Instead, we can be much more vigorous. We can lift the embargo, allow arming, especially of Bosniaks at that moment and Croats, and also, if necessary, strike through an airstrike all those who are opposing a peaceful solution. This was his proposal. And it gained traction in the public opinion. It also gained traction in the Republican Party. I remember from Clinton's memoirs, I couldn't find the exact sentence yesterday, but take my word for it. Clinton is writing in his memoir that he met Bob Dole, who was actually his competitor, but who was also rather hawkish on the issue of military intervention. And Bob Dole told him after the inauguration, look, Bill, please bomb the Serbs. It will really make you feel better. I want to emphasize that because there is this feel-good moment in the military interventions which needs to be accounted for. So Bill didn't bomb the Serbs in 92, and he didn't bomb them in 93, and he didn't bomb them in 94. Why didn't Bill bomb the Serbs? So at the moment, when politicians are campaigning, they have all sorts of ideas of how to proceed with things. And when they are in opposition, they are certainly much more flamboyant with their offer and with what they have to say. And then once they actually sit in power, they understand that the previous administration might have been beset by some complexities which didn't really dawn to them when they were in the opposition. For instance, when Clinton administration took reins, there was a really interesting set of documents which CIA recently disclosed. Whenever there is this transition of power, the US has plenty of commissions and intra-agency meetings, which is allowing the new administration to actually understand what's going on. The confidential documents are flowing, as well as policy recommendations to allow for some minimal continuity in foreign politics. It's a really useful exercise, by the way. Anyhow, after actually sitting in, he understood several things. Firstly, that European powers are absolutely disinclined to intervene militarily for different reasons. Primarily because the European powers gave smaller or bigger contingents to the United Nations peacekeeping forces, which were already deployed in Croatia and in Bosnia. They had their people on the ground, and in their feeling, any sort of military intervention from air would jeopardize their soldiers who are there in the peacekeeping function. So basically, the new US Secretary of the State returned from Europe, understanding that he doesn't have support even of Great Britain, let alone the others, in bombing anybody. The other reason was that, and you can see here how these documents of transition between the two administrations actually look like. They are really to the point and they are going into the nitty-gritty. They are done by the area specialists. So the area specialists were assessing that this would be a really long and dangerous war, and that actually it wouldn't be solved solely through airstrikes, that basically deployment of the troops will be needed, and that if the UN is to pull out, then NATO has to come in, or the US has to come in, but somebody has to. And if they come in, the assessment was that who knows when will they come out. The examples of the Second World War were brought up, and the guerrilla experience of the Second World War, where Bosnia was actually Tito's fortress for a long while, and so on and so forth. So basically, many elements in the administration were actually against lift and against strike. That had led the US to another challenge. Okay, so then what to do? Well, why don't we really try the multilateral approach? There were peace negotiations throughout this period. And I mean, okay, it's not a unique situation, but I think it's rather extreme that throughout war in Bosnia, there were protracted negotiations from basically before the war started until it ended. So constantly there were some negotiations. Here you can see the map of Bosnia and also several peace plans which were offered. The red color denotes Serbian majority, the blue color Croat, the green Muslim. It might seem that there is no huge difference to you, but I can tell you that it's a huge difference for people who are actually living there. Like a small curve of a pencil left and right easily means the fate of 100,000 people. So anyhow, the US was present and not present during those negotiations in the first phase, because the negotiations were handled by the UN and by the European community. The European community was represented at first by Lord David Owen, British former politician, but the UN was presented by Cyrus Vance, which is important because Cyrus Vance was at the same time former state secretary during the Carter administration. So he was sort of like unofficial US voice, or so it seemed. So it seemed because the US actually, in a sense, boycotted and undermined the first comprehensive agreement which was on the table, called the Vance-Owen Peace Plan. It was at the time of lift and strike bravado. So the idea was that the US can somehow come up with a better deal than the Vance-Owen plan. In reality, if we look at these different maps, we will see that this didn't happen. So unfortunately, the US didn't help to come about with a peace solution. It's dubious if it could have been done, but they didn't really seriously even try. And the peaceful settlement, which was brokered 2 years afterwards, was in some ways considerably worse. But we will come to that in a moment. The other answer to the question, why didn't Bill bomb the Serbs, also has to do with path dependency. I think you're all aware of this old proverb that generals are always fighting their previous war, in a sense that the generals of this war used to be captains or majors or colonels in the last war. So their understanding and their worldview was formed in some other period. That had led to many unfortunate consequences. The First World War is an excellent case in point. And actually, Professor Ungor also mentioned it today when he explained why he feels Iraq was brutalized in 2003, because similar people, Cheney, Rumsfeld, and so on, were running the show 15 years afterwards or 20 years afterwards and finishing something they began earlier. That's also another example of the importance of path dependency. In this case, in late 1993, there was a skirmish in Mogadishu, which put in danger a number of US military personnel and had led to relatively heavy casualties. And it had also sensitized the US public opinion to the potential backclashes of being the world's policeman, and the discourse that the US should not be the world policeman, and some sort of new, I don't know how to put it, interventionist isolationism. Erna would probably try to make some sense of it. I really can't. Sort of came about. How was the challenge overcome? Well, briefly, to get you back to 1995, NATO did actually militarily intervene a couple of times in Bosnia. And that brings me to another point which we might discuss in the debate. What is actually a military intervention? We didn't really take much time in defining it. You know, how do they say? If it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's probably a duck. So clearly, if plenty of airplanes are obliterating Mariupol, that's clearly a military intervention. But what do we do with all these issues of micro interventions, of war by proxy, of clandestine actions, of arming your others foot soldiers, of economic sanctions, which can also have very devastating circumstances and consequences, including human casualties, actually. So we might spend a word or two actually defining what we mean by the military intervention. Anyway, given that the UN had its troops in Bosnia throughout the war, there were frequent calls or attempts to use aerial support in order to help those units, or in order to stop forces, mostly Serbian forces, for stepping into the UN protection zones. So, for instance, it happened once in May 1995, and it had a rather humiliating consequences. There wasn't really sufficient air power anyhow in the air, and the Serbian military reacted by simply kidnapping as many UN soldiers it could, and then tying them or chaining them to whichever objects they could, which is what you can see on one of these photos. The consequence was that the appetite for airstrikes certainly was not high in spring and summer 1995, which turned out to be horrific for Srebrenica, because when Serbian troops were advancing into the safe UN zone, the UN Dutch BAT, which was also mentioned today a couple of times, was calling for an aerial support which never came. So basically the head of the Dutch BAT found himself sharing a glass, apparently terrified, with the commander of the Serbian forces, Ratko Mladic, which you can see on another photo. Why is this important for this story? Because in a sense, it had led to a so-called endgame, the final stage of the US involvement in the Bosnian crisis, because basically the Americans would have none of that. The thing is that they would not be associated with another failed attempt at reaching a peaceful solution, and they wanted to come up with a comprehensive solution for the Yugoslav crisis, which would at the same time finish up the Bosnian conflict and the Croatian conflict, and also present the US as a problem solver. We also have abundant evidence of how it actually looked. It mostly comes from the minutes of the so-called meetings of the principals. Those are people whom you can see on this photo, which are discussing the nitty-gritty of bringing the war to an end. And it was through the concentrated effort, which involved strong and robust diplomacy of threats, and also the use of firepower in August 1995, when more serious bombings were targeting primarily Serbian military targets, that basically a final peace settlement finally came about. This action was known as deliberate force, and it's a sort of a forgotten intervention. But to me, honestly, it's not less of a watershed than the bombing of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia in 1999. Again, unlike for 1999, we have abundant documentation on weighing pros and cons. Here you can see, for instance, diagrams of the US administration of weighing pros and cons and potential outcomes of such military intervention. You see down there a range of possible outcomes: good outcome, bad outcome. What I mean to say is that the policymakers are not, or at least back then, didn't really enter into such operations lightly. They were sitting and discussing pros and cons, making diagrams and charts, or at least talking about them. The outcome is known to you, so I will not spend much time on it. Some sort of Pax Americana was imposed in the Balkans. The warlords were taken to the negotiating table in the US military base in Dayton, Ohio, as you can see on one of those pictures. And then triumphantly, somewhat later in November 1995, they were dragged to Paris to sign peace treaty known as Dayton Peace Accord. And you see here they are under the watchful gaze of their Euro-Atlantic Russian patrons. So the story allegedly had a happy end. We know that actually it didn't, because there are tremendous residues. Well, I will bring it to an end with only a couple of questions rather than the answers, because I really came here because I don't have a straight answer on the issue of military interventions. So I will just emphasize a couple of points which strive out of this quick overview. Firstly, the issue of inner politics is tremendously important. And for the most part, we are not really able to assess it. I mean, who knows now what is the real power struggle in Kremlin? I don't think that we are really smart about that. There must be some sort of power struggle, but simply in the absence of knowledge, what's happening there, perhaps it might be that some of the explanatory mechanisms to understand this madness are simply not at hand to us. We know, for instance, for the Cuban Missile Crisis, how important that dynamics was. So just to emphasize that, because we are somehow overtaken by the events that we can see, and we forget that there are things that we can't see. The importance of path dependency, very important, but it can be important in different ways. People learn from history, but sometimes they learn completely useless or downright self-defeating things. So sometimes, but what's important to say is that, like, basically American diplomacy is definitely driven by practical experiences, and basically tries out different forms and formats, and it tends to forget quickly and to learn from the nearest first experience. So the expedient and quick intervention in Kosovo in 1999, without waiting for the Security Council authorization, can as well be very much linked with this protracted muddling through the early 90s until actually it was necessary to use force in order to come to the peace solution. About legitimacy and legality, I'm really interested to hear your thought, because for me, this is the thorniest issue, because it leads me to a point that's disturbing for me. I'm struggling very much to find any sort of convincing yardstick which would enable me to say with a clear conscience that a certain military intervention is justified or not. So this is something that we might talk about. Something that Katarina raised with her wonderful article, well, scary article actually, about liberal and illiberal interventionism, is a horizon of temporality. What do I mean by that? The interventions, as we learned from Professor Ungor, have a rich prehistory. But the interventions of empires tended to be really long, centuries long. So you can take colonialism as a phenomenon, actually, as a type of an intervention and so on. So basically, okay, the Brits take India and then they stay there for 100 years, 200 years, and so on. On the one hand, it's of course brutal extraction of resources. On the other hand, it's a type of a commitment that no contemporary democratic government can take because of the succession of different regimes and the succession of different administrations. To me, it's an illusion that you can successfully intervene and meddle in the affairs of other society if you decide to do it in a couple of months or a couple of years or even a couple of decades. That needs to be, to my mind, quite a robust commitment, and that commitment is multifaceted. I mean, if it depends solely on your military invasion, I mean, it's really not likely to succeed. It's an encompassing type of a commitment which is needed. And that prompts me to my last point, which is that probably, to my mind, again, the role of academics is not primarily to condone or to confront or to evaluate the legitimacy or legality of interventions, but also to think about the alternatives at the same time. I will end with a personal experience. So when NATO was bombing Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, one thing completely amazed me. NATO had ability to project its propaganda however it wanted. So it could throw whatever it wanted from the air. And the televisions which would be emitted by the NATO were completely visible at the territory of Yugoslavia. And of course, being a curious kid back then, I really wanted to see, you know, finally this propaganda at work, to see how it actually happens. And I was so bitterly disappointed. You see, for the most part, propaganda was resting on some sort of half-baked leaflets which were thrown out of air in sometimes barely understandable Serbian or in vernaculars which are not really, which seem clumsy. One such example is here on the PowerPoint. And then, okay, I turn on the TV to see what's happening. And lo and behold, I see that very same leaflet for hours, front and back, front and back. And I'm thinking, okay, well, somebody is really low on imagination these days. But given that we are not low on imaginations, I think it's time for me to stop, and then we can continue talking about this indeed troublesome issue, which turns to be a defining issue of our lives. And again, if I can re-emphasize that, back in the 90s, where my country was falling apart, there was an illusion that we are somehow the last remnant of the 20th century, while Europe is integrating, Yugoslavia is disintegrating, and so on. And the Yugoslavs and also the rest of the world were looking at Sierra Leone, Rwanda, Yugoslavia as some sort of bizarre hiccups, the last deadly kiss of the 20th century. Unfortunately, we are wiser now, and we basically see that this was rather like augmenting of the New World disorder that we are living through today. And I fear that we are not going to be rid of that problem in our lifetimes. So we might as best discuss it now. Thank you so much for your attention.
Okay, thank you all. Thanks for bringing so many other topics, and I'm sure that they will be picked up now in the discussion. So I simply open the floor and ask the audience here and also those online to ask questions. Now we have 3 discussants, if you want, you have presenters here, and you are of course invited to ask questions to any relating to any of the topics they introduced.
Yeah, sorry to cut you off, Katarina, but I just wanted to come in with a couple of thoughts which were inspired by the first 2 presentations that we heard just now, but also I think tie in quite well with Dr. Petrovich's presentation as well. By the way, this was an awesome panel. I just want to say that I thought all of the presentations were fantastic and very informative. So congratulations to all of you. My first question, you know, Dr. Buray, when you were talking about these differences between liberal internationalism versus illiberal nationalism, and you showed these quotes to illustrate each one, I was struck by how emotional the liberal internationalism once sounded. as opposed to the illiberal nationalism ones. And I was thinking about the issue of legitimacy and perhaps democratic legitimacy, which I think ties in with Dr. Petrovich's presentation as well. So this idea, he talked about legitimacy on the world stage, but I was also thinking about legitimacy within one's own country, and how much really all of you think that that matters in terms of this sort of two different globalization projects. And my second question, which I think several of you could talk to me about, is, yes, Dr. Nielsen, you mentioned that Serbia has been consistently blind, or perhaps willingly ignorant to the fact that Russia is only supporting it opportunistically. And I was wondering, why do you think that is, in terms of its allies, in terms of its relationships with other countries? Why would this consistent blindness keep appearing? So those are my questions for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Teresa. Then let's start with Anna and just keep the chronological order.
Yes, thank you so much for this question, Teresa. Very inspiring, I have to say. And it reminds me of a recent special issue of Journal of Narrative Politics. And there was a special issue about half a year ago, that says writing international politics as if people mattered, which is a very radical statement, as if people mattered. And I was, your question shows also that actually politics is done by people and experienced by people, and emotions are very much part of that, that doing and being on the receiving end at the same time. When it comes to the differences between, so actually both sides have an emotional content, which I agree very much, and I will say what my take is on the difference. But actually, indeed, there is what Amir Pasic and Thomas Weiss in '97 called the politics of rescue. So this, the Cosmopolitan project, actually, what the Russians were kind of rightly pointing out, that this is a very black and white, a very simplistic understanding of that there is a perpetrator and there are victims, and that is simplifying both in the context of, in the social context in which a conflict takes place. It's much more complicated. But in order to be a rallying call, this has been a very, because of the human element, this conveying of urgency that we need to do something now, it actually is a very real emotional content that this discourse, so a justification for military intervention, instrumentalizes, utilizes. And I remember having talked to the Brazilian, who was Maria Viotti, who was the special, the permanent representative of Brazil at the time when the Libya negotiations happened, and Brazil has traditionally been against the use of force and interventions, just like India, for instance, not just to mention the usual suspects. But she said, when we were negotiating, there was really this urgency that even if we had the principled position against the use of force, the threat of Gaddafi, the discourse of the cockroaches, and that we will purify, and the whole threat was so obvious and so urgent that we all felt that we need to do something. So this emotional content really played out and really played a role, and not just Brazil, but for instance, South Africa, which again usually takes a non-interventionist position, was actually abstaining. So let the resolution 1973 that NATO used as a grounds for its actions to pass. On the other hand, there are emotions on the other side, although it's not the same urgency. We need to do something. But I remember reading, and it's a quote from Lavrov, and I need to find it again. It was very interesting when he talked about Syria, and it was, I think, I believe in the context of justifying why Russia is not allowing the Libya scenario to happen again. And he said, we have lived through a revolution, and this is the last thing that we wish for others. So this experience of Russia to go through the 90s that I have mentioned, and the upheaval and the orderlessness, it is also an emotional content, which then feeds into order as being the primary object. But I will stop here, but thank you so much for the question. Emotions, very important, and both sides, both discourses feed on to particular emotions, experiences, and the human within.
And this relation, norms and emotions, this is another great topic to explore. There is one question here in the room, so yeah.
Thank you. What an interesting panel, interesting organization. Vladimir mentions at the end the importance of framework. I would add the importance of language, and I'm thinking of the way you frame it, Katrina, and Erna takes it up, liberal internationalism, illiberal nationalism. And I think this, that language, there are layered conversation. Language is used in a national sense, France, in a regional sense, European Union, African Union, and in an international, transnational sense, United Nations. When it goes to the international sense, the use of language verges towards the Anglo-American Atlantic discourse, and luck would have it that many academics know that language. And at the same time, it has very different meanings. At the same time, also, this is not a language in which Serbia or Russia is represented, can vocalize their perspectives. Take into account this. In the United States, liberal means progressive. In the European continent, liberal means a liberal party is a business party. It's kind of right of center. And in the UK, liberal means philosophical, liberalism, from Locke to Mill, John Stuart Mill. And at the same time, what is at issue is different relations, understandings of relations between state and society. Erich Fromm talks about freedom from oppression, libertà ouverte in Cuba. Simon Bolivar means the freedom to form your own government. In the other sense, it is the freedom, the American contemporaries, it is the freedom to have very little government and do work and do business. In other words, the whole, if we converse internationally in this language, we are walking in minefields or in a lagoon or in a morass. We are not walking on an even surface at all. We risk excluding others. We risk confusion maybe at a structural level in relation to which what Teresa mentioned, the emotional or non-emotional context is actually a minor point. This is risky. Let us avoid not echoing Atlantic hegemony or American hegemony by using our language in the hegemonic language, which is a confused language. And zoom out in the use of our language itself and the categories we use. And listen, folks, when I'm a European from Amsterdam, I happens to be living, working in the United States. In the United States, this is impossible even to discuss. Nobody will understand you. But here, this kind of worldliness, because you're all conversant in multiple conversations in different contexts, I take it you can understand it and maybe have a solution. And you say liberal internationalism, hooray! But illiberal nationalism, there can be liberal nationalism, because in nationalism we have an outward-looking nationalism and inward-looking nationalism, bunker nationalism, inclusive nationalism. So let's not tag these adjectives to the same phenomenon.
Yeah, well, thank you for this.
Sorry for being long.
No, thank you for the intervention. And I've been criticized that I expressed already my apologies sincere for taking those two broad concepts and then applying them here. And yes, criticism well taken. But the question of language and the whole kind of hegemony of English, I think that would require one serious lifetime to open. So I'm afraid we have to continue in this direction, but probably being aware and trying to trace historically how concepts are used, and what you said I find very important, and that is that words literally mean different things in different contexts, and we do have that. We took the example of liberalism, and that is absolutely true. So yes, I noted down, and we discussed that in some other panel. Meanwhile, Teresa's question for Vladimir on chat. Vladimir, do you see it, or do I?
Absolutely, absolutely. But if I could just contribute to this plethora of linguistic chaos, as my current country of residence shows, Hungary, there are also illiberal democracies, right? So indeed, life is much more complicated than our phrasing. About the question, and the question pertains to popular opinion, public opinion, and forming of foreign policy. Well, let me connect this to this issue of Serbia. I completely agree with Professor Nielsen that we are all waiting for the current Serbian President Vučić to say something about future directions of Serbian foreign politics. He's in a precarious position, and it's in complete relation to the public opinion. His party won a couple of weeks ago at the general elections, and he himself, who is a right-winger and who had contributed to the right-wing push of the Serbian politics tremendously, came to the constituency and warned constituency that there is a right-wing turn in the country. What did he actually mean by that? The way I read those tabloids that Christian had shown us earlier is that the government is desperately trying to desensitize public opinion and to swing it really quickly from this sort of Putinophilia or Russophilia that the government contributed itself to form, and to basically untie and allow for a wider margin, because Serbia had some interesting positionings in the United Nations which were putting it against the Russian invasion. Will it succeed? This would be an answer to Teresa's question in a sense, because clearly we think that politicians can do whatever comes to their mind, but actually they cannot. They are bound by the words they use, as Erna reminded us. They are bound by their predictions of the future and all those things. So that really matters tremendously. We'll see if Serbia will manage to fight for some new space in the international relations. I would, of course, just question a bit, so I know better than to disagree with Professor Nielsen, but still, the issue of naivety of the Serbs on this matter, I think it's rather an issue of expediency as well. It's not so much mystical connection with the big brother and so on, but rather an attempt of several governments to, to use and foster that connection. And also Serbia is extremely dependent from Russia, because Russia has a heavy hand in the Serbian energetic sector, which it basically acquired in the last 20 years. So dissociating is, a bit tougher than it seems. And by the way, there is another hidden trick to this Serbo-Russian connection. They never share the border. And I noticed that Russophilia tends to evaporate the closer you get to its zone of influence. So yes, in regard to the US and the public opinion, it's certainly tremendously important. But funnily enough, now that I'm at the giving end of interventions, because I became a US citizen relatively recently, I noticed that the ability to sidetrack certain vital and important issues in the US is immense. The US public opinion seems to me collectively unable to perceive anything less than 100 million people, unless it's something historically very important like Jerusalem and so on and so forth. You know, even if you're Turkey, good luck wedging yourself in the US public discourse. I'll keep it at that.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. You really got me here speechless, but Teresa, I hope this answered, but we can continue. We are at the very end of the panel, so this is really going into very weird directions here. And as we crossed 5 minutes our panel time, I just like to let everyone know the panel is officially over, but we of course continue because Vladimir has to answer now.
Actually, I have a question because indeed I came here to learn. So we are not going to make this panel about Serbia, but the case is interesting because it shows what are the long-term effects of bombing. If you take anti-NATO sentiments and so on, you get the picture that basically Serbia is actually in this position with a reason with prehistory. But my question for all of you actually is the following. If we have extreme cynicism in the East and the way intervention is being used, and if we have quite some amount of hypocrisy in the West in the way military intervention is used or selectivity. And we saw so many examples during these speeches today. So what's the way ahead, in your opinion? Erna, I would really like to hear your opinion on that one. Can there even be a normative opinion under such circumstances?
Okay, let's hear them.
To me, the most interesting question, and again, just offering a question back, is this last one that I have finished my presentation on, whether what Russia has done will bring us a dismantling of the current understanding of what is legitimate use of force as we understand it. And it seems to me that the cosmopolitan project at least carries some sort of, I mean, I don't want to contradict myself because I was just saying that both have a legitimate grounding and carries with it fundamental values. But I believe that as far as I can tell, there has been a lot of effort disentangling genuine and hypocritical uses, and a lot of effort goes into also analyzing Russian genuine and hypocritical elements in uses of justification. For example, Roy Ellison from Oxford have done a lot of work on that, or Yekaterina Stepanova, whom Katerina mentioned. To me, it seems that for now on, it is an aggression, and it's largely evaluated as such, although I have to say I am probably very much embedded in a Western liberal bubble, and this is what I read. I do not read Russian, so although I've been reading Russia Today to get a hint of whatever it can be gained in English language understanding. So it seems to me that currently this is not a legitimate move that Russia has done. But for understandable reasons, it has supporters, such as China is not. I mean, China is in a very cornered position in supporting or contradicting Russia. But my impression is that this is so far not legitimate. Whereas in the case of the Western uses and justifications, the underlying motivation that is embedded in a broader normative development, which has been encapsulated with R2P, not the humanitarian intervention, not the right to intervene, but there has been a minimal consensus that there are certain atrocities that need an international response. And I believe that if we can say the shared understanding is that the West has been abusing it at certain points, or it should not have gone this far, but there is still a thin normative consensus that this requires an international response. And therefore, the West still has some legitimate core in some of its interventions, whereas what is happening in Russia, it is clearly illegitimate in my view. So when you ask for the way forward, I'm just curious how this assessment may be changing, if it will be. I don't know what you all think, Katarina.
Thank you. Well, I would actually use what you just said as a little bit of hope that actually there is some clarity in what is happening and that we can take it from here. And as for Vladimir's question, it's a very unfair question, which is a more invitation for a drink, and let's go and discuss this on the next conference. And I'm sure that this is going to happen very soon. But meanwhile, I'm just informed that I have to close the panel because the next one is starting. So thank you all once again. I really tremendously enjoyed. And thank you for all your inputs and discussions. And I certainly hope to meeting you all at some new conference.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Katarina. Thank you all of you for being here under the banyan tree. Bye.
Under the circumstances, with a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks.